Hi there, this is Dr. Robert Cywes. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. And today is the first in a short series, a mini series, on the topic diabetes. We're going to go through at first talking about and giving you an understanding of carbohydrates and how they work in the body, sugar and starch. Then we'll talk about the current principles of diabetes management, the so-called best practice guidelines that are used by endocrinologists and doctors in the world out there, not to treat diabetes, not to cure diabetes, not to put diabetes into remission, but to make people more and more diabetic based on an incorrect understanding of how diabetes happens. And I use the word diabetes as a generic word. The next episode, the third one, will be about type 2 diabetes, the fourth one about type 1 diabetes, the fifth one about insulin resistance and gestational diabetes, so that you get an understanding of how all of this fits together. And if you can apply this to yourself, really the goal of these podcasts is to use biology and science as taken from a doctor with some knowledge and describe it from a layperson's perspective so that you can apply that knowledge to your own life to improve your health and to be happier in your own life. So today we're going to address diabetes, and it's not just for diabetics. It's for people that have the potential to become that way or become insulin resistant. So the first conceptual myth and the conceptual understanding that is so important when it comes to understanding how you become diabetic and how to get rid of it is not to be fooled by the concept of good carbohydrates and bad carbohydrates. There's so much misinformation out there. What are carbohydrates? It doesn't matter if carbohydrates come in the form of a starch or a simple sugar. Ultimately, if you look at carbohydrates from this perspective, there are three primary monosaccharides, three primary sugars: glucose, galactose, and fructose. Those are the three primary six-sided carbon hexagons that are the three primary sugars. And ultimately, it's those three sugars that end up in your bloodstream and that cause the damaging effects of carbohydrates. Now, if you take those simple building blocks, and let's go up a step, and you combine two of them. If you combine glucose plus glucose, you've got something called maltose, malt sugar. If you combine the commonest one, which is one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose, and you create that so-called disaccharide, you've got common sugar, what we call sugar. Okay? Fructose and fructose as a molecule together doesn't exist in nature. It's always glucose and fructose, or fructose by itself, which is very common in fruit. But fructose is a monosaccharide, or fructose is a disaccharide, common in fruit. The milk products primarily have galactose with glucose, one molecule of galactose, one molecule of glucose, that becomes the sugar in milk. So those are the common paradigms. Now, if you take chains of those sugars and you link glucose, 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 and you form this long chain like a necklace, if you think about a pearl necklace with bunches of pearls strung together, every one of those little pearls is a molecule of glucose. As you add them up, they become something we call starch. So starch is ultimately just a chain of sugars. And here's the key thing. It doesn't matter how the sugar or the starch goes in your face. It doesn't matter if you drink it or eat it. It doesn't matter if it's a starch or a simple sugar. It doesn't matter if it's a combination of fructose, glucose, galactose, glucose, glucose, glucose. Because here's the way the human intestine handles this. And this is what makes us human. Humans are primarily designed to use enzymes to cleave or to break down those chains of sugars, whether it's a disaccharide or a whole starch, into individual carbohydrate molecules: glucose, galactose, fructose. And throughout the intestinal tract, starting in your mouth, you've got an enzyme called amylase that breaks that down. In the intestine, in the stomach, it begins to break it down. In the intestine, you've got enzymes all along the way that cleave that sugar. And ultimately what gets absorbed into your bloodstream through the intestinal blood system are the simple sugars. Glucose, galactose, fructose enters the bloodstream. And all of that blood goes into one channel. All of the blood from the intestine goes into one channel called the portal vein. And the portal vein is a system that runs from the intestine directly to the liver. So the liver has a very, very high, what we call first pass effect when it comes to sugar. Almost all the sugar in the human body goes directly through the liver, and the liver has this filtration system that absorbs very rapidly the sugar into the liver cells. A small fraction of it bypasses or runs through the liver untouched and gets into the systemic system, into the rest of your blood space, into the rest of your body. But the majority of that comes into the liver filters it, both the endothelial cells, the cells that line the blood vessels, and then the hepatocytes, the liver cells themselves. And how does that happen? How does that sugar very readily get taken up by these cells in the liver? It gets taken up under the influence of insulin. So insulin results in the uptake and the transition of sugar from the bloodstream into the tissues, primarily the liver, but all the tissues in the body. Now, there are certain cells that will take up sugar without the influence of insulin. Endothelial cells, for example, the cells that line blood vessels, do not require insulin to take up that sugar. So sugar very rapidly enters these endothelial cells. I'm going to get back to that in a second. So one of the key principles when it comes to understanding carbohydrates, there is no such thing as a good carbohydrate or a bad carbohydrate. And that is a misconception from the world out there. You live in the world out there, they will tell you an apple is perfectly healthy, but a donut is not so good for you. I will tell you it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant, particularly if you're diabetic, pre-diabetic, or obese, or have metabolic syndrome. Because if you look at the total carbohydrate content of of an apple, and you look at the total carbohydrate content of a donut, the apple has almost twice as much sugar as the donut. So what you want to change your way of thinking is change your way of thinking to look at the total carbohydrate content of what you're putting in your face, whether it's a drink or a food, not whether they tell you it's healthy or not. I've used this in a previous episode. If you've got a dog, do you eat your dog's poop? Hell no, I don't eat my dog's poop. But what happens if I sprinkle some carbohydrates and sprinkle some protein, sprinkle some minerals and vitamins on your dog's poop and give it a good smell and a good taste? It's still dog poop. Okay? And I don't care how you flavor it, I'm not eating it. Well, think of sugar in that way. And an apple is just pure sugar with a little bit of protein and fiber sprinkled on it. That doesn't make it healthy. Additives do not make carbohydrates healthy. This is a Cywes line. Additives do not make carbohydrates healthy for the person that has suffered the consequence of chronic carbohydrate toxicity. If you're fat, if you're diabetic, if you have metabolic syndrome, you are a carbohydrate addict. And it doesn't matter how healthy some idiot in the world out there tells you it is harmful to your body when it goes in your face. And you cannot burn it off with exercise. You cannot burn it off with exercise. Nobody smokes 3 cigarettes and goes for a run to blow out the nicotine. You cannot exercise away your carbohydrate load. We'll talk about that in a second. So it doesn't matter how it enters your face. But in the second episode, I'll discuss the glycemic index and glycemic load. So let's take the sugar through the body. The intestine breaks it down, whether you've eaten a pizza, whether it's brown bread, white bread, baked potato, French fries, ice cream, pure sugar. What enters your bloodstream, glucose, galactose, fructose, rapidly into the endothelial cells. The endothelial cells swell up and already contribute to hypertension, high blood pressure, because remember, every molecule of sugar is attached to a molecule of water, and it's that water that enters the cells that's as damaging as the sugar itself. So that sugar and that water enters the cells swell up, they narrow the lumen of the blood vessels, and they create hypertension, high blood pressure. On the other side of that, as those endothelials swell up and they separate, they injure or they leave little gaps, and those gaps are a form of injury. And now you need to form a clot to that. And those little blood clots get infiltrated with platelets, activated white cells, and to stabilize them, along comes the body and lays down fat. LDL is actually an anti-inflammatory molecule. LDL is designed to try to heal the injury that was originally caused by sugar. It's not causing damage, like so many people, the statin people out there try to convince us about. No, it's trying to heal the damage. But these clots form, and if those clots break off, they travel downstream, you get a heart attack, a stroke. If the clots coalesce and they block the lining of that blood vessel, those downstream tissues don't get oxygen, they don't get food, they die. And that is how sugar injures every organ in the human body that gets supplied by blood, that needs oxygen, that needs nutrients through the bloodstream. Because when that bloodstream narrows and it blocks off, it kills off those tissues. But then that excess sugar under the influence of insulin gets into your muscles and primarily into the liver, and the liver under the influence of insulin very rapidly stores a little bit as glycogen, probably about 400 to 600 grams. Glycogen, why glycogen? Glycogen is a chain of sugar, it's a starch. And it's a linkage chain of sugar to exclude the water. And then what happens is once your glycogen stores are replete, the liver also produces fat. And as you've seen in another episode about fatty liver, and I'd urge you to go back to look at that, as the liver converts that sugar to fat, some of that fat can't get out of the liver quick enough, so you get a fatty liver, this big, swollen, gelatinous fatty liver. But slowly over time, you can transport that fat as triglycerides in the bloodstream. That's the way the fat that comes from sugar is transported as free triglycerides in the bloodstream, and you can measure that on a lipid panel as elevated triglycerides. But some of it is also transported in LDL, predominantly as triglycerides. So therefore, when your triglycerides go up, that is the most important marker that correlates with cardiovascular injury and cardiovascular disease, because it tells us about the chronic excessive consumption of sugar. And in fact, the paradox is this, that when your body becomes resistant to that insulin, so that it's no longer able to take that sugar up, it's no longer able to convert that sugar to fat, that is the liver and your tissue saying, I'm not going to do my work, I'm not going to respond to insulin. So under those conditions, as that insulin rises up but it's not doing its job, the sugar accumulates in the bloodstream. And as that sugar builds up in the bloodstream and it reaches a particular point, you're hyperglycemic. And over time, that sugar damages the red blood cells and it attaches to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. We call that hemoglobin A1C, or glycosylated hemoglobin. And as your percentage of glycosylated hemoglobin goes up, there's a particular number at which we call people diabetic. And that number is 6.5. Okay? And that's when they call somebody diabetic to treat them. I'll talk more about that in the second episode. But that's diabetes. Now, under certain conditions, you can produce more insulin, and your insulin level goes through the roof. We can measure that insulin level, goes through the roof. That's called hyperinsulinemia. And hyperinsulinemia is the consequence of insulin resistance by the liver and other tissues. So your insulin builds up trying to force the liver and the tissues to convert that excess sugar to fat. Because if you convert the excess sugar to fat, it's protective of damage to the bloodstream. That's how the body protects itself for a while. But eventually that system fails. And eventually, no matter how much insulin you produce, how hyperinsulinemic you are, your insulin resistance overwhelms that. And that's when your blood sugar builds up. And that's when you get diabetes. And every single human being who eats carbohydrates, irrespective of how they go in their face, in a chronic, excessive way, over time will develop the diseases associated with the word diabetes, the diabetogenic diseases. They may start later if you become enormous, obesogenic first, and then become diabetic. They may start early, and you may get into the diabetes realm, diabetes diseases much earlier, depending on your genetic capacity to produce insulin. So some people can't produce a lot of insulin, other people can produce a huge amount. But irrespective, over time, everybody suffers the ravages of the diseases that we call diabetes. That is my explanation of carbohydrates. No carbohydrates, no diabetes. No carbohydrates, no insulin resistance. It doesn't get better like this, but it gets better darn quickly. The next few episodes will explain some of that in more detail. Please tune in for the next one.